Whenever you hear the name Nigeria, the first thought that comes to mind is Africa, the giant of Africa. That narrative is shifting rapidly to insecurity, corruption, and inflation. But above all, scammers. Nigerians all over the world are now associated, judged, and branded as scammers because of the country's notorious reputation for internet fraud. But before crypto schemes, BEC, tax returns, and romance scammers, there was a man who placed Nigeria on the map with the most elaborate and well-executed scams of all time. This was a man who sold an airport that never existed. This is Emmanuel Nwude, the greatest Nigerian scammer of all time. This story begins as many other great frauds do, with a piece of paper. In April 1995, Nelson Sakaguchi, a quiet, meticulous director at a branch of a mid-sized commercial bank in Brazil, received a fax at his office. The fax came from Nigeria. It was written in competent English, professionally formatted, and bore what appeared to be the letterhead of the Central Bank of Nigeria. The author identified himself as Paul Oguma, the governor of Central Bank Nigeria. The fax outlined an extraordinary opportunity. The Nigerian federal government, it explained, was seeking an international banking partner to help facilitate funding for a major infrastructure project, the construction of a new international airport in Abuja, Nigeria's capital city. The deal was straightforward on paper, or so it seemed. Banco Noroeste would wire a series of payments to a designated government account in Nigeria, and in return, the bank's director involved would personally receive a commission exceeding $10 million once the construction contract was activated. Sakaguchi had spent years in banking. He was not an impulsive man, but there was something about this letter that caught his attention. It was the grandiosity of it, the apparent legitimacy of a central bank governor reaching out directly, and perhaps, most of all, the extraordinary promise of personal windfall. So he did not immediately pick up the phone to call the Central Bank of Nigeria to verify the letter's authenticity. He did not engage any legal team to conduct due diligence. Instead, he replied. The reply was eventually what cost his bank its very existence. Behind that fax was a man named Emmanuel Nwude, a 44-year-old businessman from Anambra State in southeastern Nigeria. Unlike the fictional identity that he assumed, Nwude was not the central bank governor. He was a director at the Union Bank in Nigeria, which, to be fair, was one of the country's largest commercial banks. That meant he had genuine knowledge of how the financial institution worked, what official documents looked like, and, crucially, how to make things appear credible to the untrained international eye. Nwude was not a desperate criminal operating out of a backstreet internet cafe. He was a wealthy man with a legitimate business interest, large property portfolio, and a network of influential contacts. He had a lifestyle that already placed him among Nigerians' elite. He owned companies, drove luxurious cars, and moved easily through Lagos higher society. But he also understood with remarkable clarity a peculiar vulnerability in the global financial system, which was the willingness of some bankers to suspend ordinary caution when confronted with the combination of an apparent government authority and an irresistible personal commission. The scheme he had constructed was technically a 419 fraud, named after the section 419 of Nigeria's criminal code, which governs advance fee fraud. This scam had been circulating in Nigeria since 1980, typically targeting ordinary individuals and promising millions locked in government accounts or unclaimed inheritance, popularly known as the Nigerian Prince scam. Most victims would lose a few $1,000s, but Nwude had a different vision. He was not aiming at private individuals with modest saving. He would aim at an institution, a real bank with real assets, and he would do it while pretending to be among the most powerful financial figures in Africa. Nwude did not work alone to pull off this scam. Around him, he assembled a small tight group of 4 co-conspirators. One was Nzeribe Ide Okoli. This person later claimed that he initiated the first contract with Sakaguchi and received approximately $4 million before Nwude cut him off the arrangement entirely. There's also Christian Ikechukwu Anajemba, a businessman and a close associate of Nwude's, and his wife Amaka Anajemba. There was also Emmanuel Afoilo and Obum Osakwe. This individual played various roles, posing as government official, managing bank accounts through which the money would be channeled, and helping produce documentation that gave the scheme a veneer of legitimacy. The documents themselves were a work of criminal craftsmanship. They bore official-looking letterhead from the Central Bank of Nigeria, the Federal Ministry of Aviation, and various official government bodies. There were contact numbers, specific reference details for supposed Abuja International Airport construction contract. Each document was designed to look like an output of a real government apparatus, complete with formal language and procedural reference that a banker examining them would expect to see. To further add a layer of credibility, Nwude and his associates created a network of shell companies and bureau de change business through which the funds would ultimately be laundered. Emerus Auto Nigerian Limited, Ocean Oil Marketing Co. Nigerian Limited, and Africa Shelter Bureau de Change Limited. These were real Nigerian companies, but they simply had no involvement with any airport. At some point in 1995, the fax exchanges progressed into direct meetings. Nwude and his associates traveled to London, a neutral, prestigious location that conveyed seriousness without requiring them to host Sakaguchi in Nigeria, where the lack of any actual construction sites might have raised question. In the London hotel rooms and meeting venues, Sakaguchi met men who presented themselves as senior Nigerian government officials, spoke with authority about state infrastructural program, and outlined the mechanics of how exactly the deal would work. Sakaguchi by all means was not a foolish man, but he was operating in an environment where the deal was structured specifically to neutralize his natural skepticism. He was not being asked to invest his own money into something risky. He was being presented an opportunity to direct a portion of his bank's funds into what appeared to be a legitimate government transaction in return for a personal commission that would set him up for life. The risk, also it seemed, was on the bank, and the reward would be on him. The meeting in London went well and Sakaguchi was convinced, so he returned back to Sao Paulo and quietly began the process of moving the money. Between April 1995 and January 20th, 1998, Nelson Sakaguchi authorized a series of transfers from Banco Noroeste accounts to various bank accounts designated by Nwude and his associates. The money moved through accounts in the Cayman Islands, Swaziland, United Kingdom, United States, and Nigeria. Each transfer was justified internally at the bank as part of an ongoing Abuja Airport project financing. The sums were staggered and escalated over time, and by the time the last wire cleared in January 1998, a total of $191 million in cash had been transferred, with accrued interest calculated on the outstanding amounts. The total loss to the Banco Noroeste will eventually be tailed at $242 million. To put that figure into perspective, it represented roughly 40% of Banco Noroeste's entire capital. The bank had effectively handed over nearly everything they had to a man in Lagos who never laid a single foundation of stone, never filed a single planning permit, and never built anything remotely resembling an airport. The question that would later preoccupy prosecutors, regulators, and banking experts in multiple countries was a simple one. How? How did a mid-sized bank wire $242 million to a fictional government account over 3 years without anyone other than the authorizing director noticing? Part of the answer lies in the structure of banking oversight in that era. In the mid-1990s, international wire transfer did not receive the same level of automated scrutiny that they do today. Anti-money laundering regulation existed, but they were inconsistently applied. The chain of intermediate banking through which international transfer flowed was complex enough that no single institution had a clear picture of where money was going to, or why. Part of the answer also lies in the psychological architecture of the con. Nwude and his associates had framed the arrangement not as a dubious private scheme, but as a government-backed infrastructural project. In the 1990s, Nigeria was attempting to establish Abuja as a functional model capital after decades of Lagos-centric governance. A new international airport for Abuja was not an implausible proposition. The city genuinely needed upgraded aviation infrastructure. The fraudster had chosen a cover story that fit the reality of Nigeria's development ambition closely enough that it didn't immediately raise flags. And then there was the commission. Sakaguchi had been promised a personal payment of more than $10 million once the project reached certain milestones. This created a powerful incentive for him to keep authorizing transfer, to remain credulous in the face of any inconsistencies, and to protect their arrangement from scrutiny. Even if he had not consciously admitted to himself that this might be fraudulent, greed is a remarkable silencer of doubt. Once the fund left Banco Noroeste account, they moved through a sophisticated labyrinth of financial jurisdiction. Some funds were held in the Cayman Islands, a detail that would later prove significant when investigators found an unusually large sum of money sitting in an unmonitored offshore account. Some passed through Switzerland, where several bank accounts had been established specifically to receive and distribute the proceeds. Some moved to accounts in the United Kingdom and United States, where Nwude and his associates maintained financial footholds. But much of the money ultimately found its way back to Nigeria, where it was channeled through Nwude's network of companies where they changed business and converted into assets and absorbed into the fabric of Nigerian business life. Nwude and his accomplice gang spent it on luxury properties, expensive vehicles, and other investment that made them appear to the casual observer to be successful and legitimate businessmen. Christian Ayajemba, one of Nwude's key accomplices, was shot and killed in 1998, the same year that the final transfers were made. His death was widely attributed to a business dispute unrelated to the fraud, but his assassination left his wife Amaka as the surviving inheritor of his share of the proceeds. She would later become one of the defendants in the Nigerian criminal proceedings. There's a detail to this fraud's history that is almost too remarkable to believe, yet it is documented in the court records. Even after Banco Noroeste suspended Sakaguchi when the suspicion first emerged in 1997, the transfers did not immediately stop. Sakaguchi had been so thoroughly captured by the con, so committed to his belief that he was on the verge of receiving this massive commission, that he reportedly continued transferring funds, this time using his own personal money. This behavior, irrationally as it appears to be from the outside, is a textbook consequence of what psychologists call the sunk cost fallacy. Combined with the escalating commitment typical of advanced fee scam, the more Sakaguchi had invested, the more psychologically necessary it became to believe that the payoff was coming. Nwude's associates understood this mechanism intuitively and exploited it ruthlessly. Sakaguchi was eventually arrested at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York and extradited to Switzerland to face charges related to opening bank accounts used in fraud. He would ultimately become a key prosecution witness in the Nigerian trial, the man who had enabled the fraud testifying against the man who had manipulated him. In 1997, Banco Noroeste had attracted the attention of Banco Santander, the Spanish banking giant that was in the process of a significant expansion across Latin America. Santander's acquisition terms began conducting due diligence on Noroeste, the standard financial examination that preceded any major banking merger or acquisition. What they found defied easy explanation. Approximately 40% of Banco Noroeste's capital appeared to be sitting in a single, large, essentially unmonitored account in the Cayman Islands. There was no standard investment rationale document associated with it, no clear explanation of the underlying transaction, and no obvious link to any of the bank's regular business activities. Santander's due diligence team flagged it immediately. The resulting investigation spread rapidly across multiple jurisdictions. Regulators and law enforcement in Brazil, Britain, Switzerland, Nigeria, and the United States all became involved as investigators attempted to reconstruct the trail of money. The picture that emerged was both appalling in its scale and, in a perverse way, elegant in its simplicity. Over 3 years, a man in Lagos had convinced a banker in Sao Paulo that a fictional Nigerian government construction project was real, and the banker had wired him nearly $250 million. For the family who owned Banco Noroeste, the discovery was catastrophic, but it arrived at the worst possible moment. The bank was in the middle of being sold, and the $242 million hole in its bank sheet threatened to kill the deal entirely. Santander, the buying bank, could not and would not absorb the loss of that magnitude as part of the acquisition. Facing the prospect of watching their bank simply disintegrate, the owning family made an extraordinary decision. They would pay the $242 million shortfall out of their own personal wealth to make the bank's sheet whole again and to allow the Santander sale to proceed. It was perhaps the most expensive act of institutional face saving in Brazilian banking history. The good news is, the sales did proceed, but the bad news is the damage was too deep and the financial wound was too severe. Despite the owner's effort, Banco Noroeste never recovered, and in 2001, the bank that had stood for decades in the Brazilian financial landscape ceased to exist. A single man's fraud executed from Lagos with forged faxes and invented contracts had killed it. As the investigators picked apart the money trail, attention focused increasingly on Nigeria. The transferred funds led not to any government office in Abuja, not to any construction company laying foundations for an airport, but to a private businessman named Emmanuel Nwude and his network of associates and shell companies. The investigation proceeded on multiple tracks simultaneously. In Switzerland, the authorities froze approximately $12 million in bank accounts linked to Nwude and his co-conspirators. In California, Kentucky, Florida, and London, legal proceedings were initiated to identify and seize further assets. Forensic accountants from a consulting group in Miami had reconstructed the flow of funds with painstaking detail, tracking dollar through corresponding bank account chains across more than a dozen countries. In Nigeria itself, the investigation faced more complicated landscape. In the late 1990s, Nigeria was still just emerging from a decade of corrupt military rule. There was no dedicated anti-corruption or financial crime enforcement body. The country's reputation for endemic fraud made the prospect of a credible prosecution there appear to many observers deeply unlikely. But in 1999, Nigeria's political landscape changed dramatically when Olusegun Obasanjo won the presidential election and ended the long era of military governance. Obasanjo, a founding member of Transparency International and a man who himself had been in prison under the previous military regime, came to power with a stated commitment to tackling corruption. The Bank on Arrest case, which had become an international embarrassment for Nigeria and was widely cited as an evidence for the country's lawlessness, was exactly the kind of matter his administration needed to address. At Obasanjo's personal request, the Nigerian parliament passed legislation in 2002 creating the Economic and Financial Crime Commission, the EFCC. It was a new investigative and prosecutory body specifically designed to handle complex financial crimes of the kind that had, until then, fallen through the cracks of Nigeria's fragmented legal system. The commission's first major target was Emmanuel Nwude, and in 2003, investigators arrested Nwude at his residence in Ikoyi, one of Lagos' most affluent neighborhoods. All of his assets were seized simultaneously: properties, vehicles, shares, investment, and entire undertaking of his company. In 2004, Nwude and his accomplice were charged in the Abuja High Court with 86 counts of fraudulently seeking advance fee and 15 counts of bribery. Nwude was separately charged with attempting to bribe the EFCC's own chairman with $75,000 in cash. You can imagine the audacity, given that the EFCC chairman, Ribadu, was the same man leading the prosecution against him. He was also charged with attempting to kidnap a prosecution witness. Despite the chaos and delay, the evidence against Nwude was overwhelming. The forensic accountant had traced every dollar. The forged document had been authenticated as forgery. Nelson Sakaguchi himself had agreed to testify for the prosecution. Faced with the plethora of evidence, Nwude and one of his co-defendants eventually pleaded guilty, motivated according to the legal observers by the hopes of a more lenient sentencing. The guilty plea triggered a plea of bargain processes. As part of the agreement, Nwude agreed to forfeit a substantial list of assets, landed properties, vehicles, shares and stocks, and the entire undertaking of the Emirus Auto Nigerian Limited, to be used as restitution for the victim. The properties included holdings in Lagos and other parts of Nigeria that Nwude had accumulated over decades. Justice J.O.K. Oyewole of the Lagos State High Court, who would later be elevated to the Supreme Court of Nigeria, delivered the judgment. Nwude received 5 years of consecutive sentences for 5 years each, for a total of 25 years. Okoli received 4 years. A fine of $10 million was imposed on Nwude, payable to the Nigerian federal government. It was the first important major conviction secured by the newly created EFCC, and it sent a message, also it was intended, that Nigeria's days of sheltering international fraudsters were numbered. It was the first major conviction in Nigerian history for advanced fee scam of this scale. The world was watching. But this is unfortunately not the end, because in 2006, Emmanuel Nwude walked out of prison. He had been sentenced to 25 years and he served just around 2 years. If you can't tell right now, I'm trying not to laugh while recording this. The mechanics of his early release remained somewhat opaque, but the outcome was stark. The man who had single-handedly destroyed a major Brazilian bank was free before the decade even ended. The reaction in Brazil and international financial circle was one of barely suppressed disbelief. Bank on Arrest was gone. The Simonson and the Cocherain family had paid millions of dollars out of their personal wealth trying to save it. Hundreds of employees had lost their job when it collapsed. Nelson Sakaguchi had been arrested, extradited and prosecuted. And the architect of the entire scheme, who was 2 years into his 25-year sentencing, was already walking free in the street of Lagos. Nwude's release from prison was not the end of his legal activities. It was, in a sense, the very beginning of a new phase. He was now on a quest to recover some of his assets that had previously been seized as part of the plea bargain, a substantial part of which had already been sown to compensate the victim and pay off fines, but Nwude had not accepted this outcome as final. He filed a lawsuit seeking to recover a portion of the seized assets on the grounds that some of what had been taken predated the Bank on Arrest fraud and could not therefore be legitimately taken as proceeds of a crime. And this argument was legally defensible. In principle, assets genuinely acquired before a crime cannot simply be forfeited as though they were gained by it. The case worked its way through Nigeria's court system over multiple years and eventually resulted in Nwude successfully reclaiming at least $52 million in previously seized assets. Let me remind you what we currently have on ground once more. The man who had defrauded a bank of $242 million served just 2 years out of a 25-year prison sentence and agreed to forfeit all of his assets as condition of his legal plea, had through litigation legally recovered $52 million. In the Nigerian legal system, through the mechanism the same system provides, he had practically reversed his own sentence. But that's not all. Nwude's post-prison life was not quiet. On August 19, 2016, the town of Ukpo in the Dunukofia area of Anambra State was attacked by a group of more than 200 armed individuals, apparently in connection with a long-standing land dispute with the neighboring Agbagana community. 4 police officers were shot and a security guard named Emmanuel Nwude was killed. The Anambra State Police Command alleged that Emmanuel Nwude was the ringleader of the attack and arrested him on 27 charges including murder, attempted murder and terrorism. He was held at the Awka prison but was released on bail in December 2016. The murder charges ultimately did not result in any conviction. Nwude at this point had become a figure of enduring fascination in Nigerian public life. He was simply a man who could not stay out of court and equally a man who could not stay inside of it. Fast forward to February 2021, Nwude appeared before Justice Mojisola Dada of the Ikeja Special Offense Court and offered a remarkable testimony. While the rest of the world had long since accepted the documented records of the Bankun arrest fraud, Nwude claimed under oath that he was unaware of the source of the $242 million that had been transferred into his account. He further alleged that his legal team had pressured him into entering his guilty plea nearly 2 decades earlier. While these claims were not accepted by the legal system, it illustrated something important about Nwude as a figure. His relationship with the truth was thoroughly instrumental. Facts were not fixed things to him. They were simply starting positions in a negotiation. He had been found guilty by his own admission. He had served his sentence. He had reclaimed his own money. And now, years later, he was attempting to spin the original conviction from the witness stand. You just have to admit, this is really impressive. Something strange happened recently. 2 weeks after drafting this particular script, Nwude appeared in court again. I knew there was an ongoing case, but I did not know it was this severe. But I'll sum it up for you. In 2005, Nwude was to forfeit a property under Emerald's Auto in Lagos as part of his plea bargain, and he did. The court sold off the property to a real estate company. That real estate company sold it to another real estate company, and then by the time Nwude was out of prison in 2006, the home actually had a new owner, a legal owner. That was a reality Nwude was unwilling to face. With the help of 2 lawyers, Nwude forged a documentation that showed that the house initially owned by Emerald's Auto was actually owned by another company called Mancris Ventures Limited. On the basis of this forged document, the court issued an eviction order to the new property's owner. Nwude then mobilized court sheriffs and police officers and physically evicted the legitimate owners of this property. GC Weze and Co., the legitimate owner of this property, returned to the same court and successfully challenged the eviction, presenting documentation that proved that the order had been obtained through fraud. Nwude and his lawyers did not accept this new setback. They filed multiple petitions across various police units in Lagos and Abuja and to the EFCC itself, attempting to generate enough procedural noise to create confusion about who legitimately owned the property. The EFCC finally received a petition about the matter in July of 2017 and opened an investigation where they found out that Nwude had forged the documentation to try to reclaim the property he had legally forfeited as a condition to avoid a longer prison sentence. Nwude alongside his lawyer Ikechukwu and Kalu were charged with 15 counts including conspiracy, forgery, altering false documents, dealing with forfeited properties, attempting to prevent the course of justice and fabricating evidence. The court found the 3 defendants guilty on 13 of the 15 counts, and from the looks of things, Emmanuel Nwude, 30 years after sending his first fraudulent fax to a banker in Sao Paulo, was going back to jail. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe because we cover mind-boggling historical documentaries on this channel. There are many more projects I'd like to cover, and I'll see you on the next one.